This will only make sense if you've already lost something. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that a wound is not a door that eventually closes, it is a room that eventually gets furnished, and you learn, slowly and against your will, how to live in it. Jung wrote in Ion, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell," an old alchemical saying he kept returning to across the years because he had watched it prove itself again and again in the consulting room. The people who tried to rise without first letting something of theirs go down into the dark were the ones who never rose at all. They only performed rising, and Jung would stop you right here and ask, "Do you see what this means? The very falling you are grieving right now may be the identical motion as the growing you think has stopped. Not two different things happening to you, one thing, seen from two different heights. And if you have spent this year waiting for the falling to end before the growing can begin, I want you to hear that Jung never separated them. He thought the root and the leaf were arguing about the same sap. So if there is a version of you that has been down in that dark root system for months now, maybe years, unable to explain to the people around you why the leaves have not come back the way everyone promised they would, this one is built for exactly you, and you are not the only one sitting in that particular room tonight. Here is a small resolution before we go any further. I no longer measure my healing by the speed at which the ache disappears. I let the loss keep its own private timeline instead of forcing mine onto it, and I trust that whatever grows back will grow back changed rather than restored. Say it with me, I make the unconscious conscious, and again, I make the unconscious conscious. Before we go on, if this kind of steady, honest teaching is useful to you, consider subscribing so that tomorrow's teaching has a way of finding you too. And if some part of what you just heard already found the ache in you, type the 2 words "face it" in the comments below, not as a performance for anyone watching, just as a small, honest seal on something you already privately know to be true. The first key is this: the grief was never a puzzle to be solved. You have probably spent real hours, maybe whole seasons, treating your loss like a broken appliance, reading the right book, trying the right routine, waiting for the day the manual finally clicks and the ache switches off. And I understand the impulse. The ego wants a mechanism, because a mechanism has an end date. But Jung wrote plainly that the greatest and most important problems of life can never be solved, but only outgrown. And grief belongs to that category, more than almost anything else does. It is not a broken part waiting for a fix. It is a permanent enlargement of who you are, which means the question was never, how do I make this go away? The question was always, how do I become large enough that this no longer runs the whole room? Imagine someone who lost a parent 2 years ago and still, quietly, schedules their week around avoiding a certain grocery store because of what used to happen there on Sunday afternoons. They have tried, in their own words, everything. A new route to work, a new morning ritual, a folder of advice from well-meaning friends, and none of it worked the way a fix is supposed to work, because none of it was ever going to. They think they are failing at grief. They think enough time and enough effort should have solved it by now. But Jung would say, they are not failing, they are simply still small for what happened to them. And smallness is not a moral failure. It is just where the growing has not yet reached. Notice how differently that sits in the body than the word failure does. Failure asks you to try harder at the wrong task. Outgrowing asks you to simply keep living long enough for the task to become the wrong question entirely. Think of a child's shoe that no longer fits. Nobody blames the shoe for having failed. They simply say the foot has grown, and something in you wants to treat your grief like a shoe that must be repaired back to its old shape. When the truer picture is a foot, quietly, painfully, outgrowing what used to contain it. So when you find yourself still flinching at a smell, a song, a certain slant of afternoon light, that is not evidence you are doing this wrong. That is only evidence the outgrowing is not finished, and it was never going to be finished on a schedule you set, or a schedule anyone around you set either, no matter how kindly they meant it. I stopped trying to solve what was only ever asking to be outgrown. The second key is this: two hands that will not shake. Because here is the part almost nobody prepares you for. At some point, you will laugh, genuinely, freely, at something small and ordinary, and half a second later, a kind of guilt will land on you like a dropped stone, as though the laughter itself were a small betrayal of what you lost. Jung called this the tension of opposites, and he meant something very specific by it. He did not mean two feelings cancelling each other out until you land at some flat, neutral middle. He meant two real and opposite truths held open at the same time without either one being asked to surrender. The truth that you miss them terribly, and the truth that you are still, undeniably, alive and capable of joy. Both of these are completely honest. And the mistake is thinking one has to defeat the other before you are allowed to feel it fully. Most people were raised on a much simpler arithmetic than this. They were taught, without anyone ever saying it outright, that feelings come one at a time, that you are either sad or you are not, either healed or you are not, either loyal to the dead or ready to move forward. As if the heart only has room for a single occupant at any given hour. But Jung watched enough real people up close to know the heart does not work like a waiting room with one chair in it. It holds several occupants at once, some of them in open contradiction, and none of them lying. Imagine a woman a year into widowhood who catches herself smiling at a memory during dinner with friends, and immediately apologizes internally, drags herself back into seriousness, as if the smile were disloyal. Or imagine a man months after losing his brother who finds himself planning a small trip, choosing a restaurant, enjoying the choosing, and then catching himself mid-enjoyment and going quiet, wondering what right he has to plan anything at all. Jung would tell both of them that grief and gladness are not on opposing teams. They are two hands reaching toward the same person from two different directions, one hand still holding what was lost, the other hand reaching, almost shyly, toward what is still here, and the discomfort they feel when both hands are open at once is not a warning that they are doing something wrong. It is simply what it feels like when the psyche is holding something honest instead of something simple. Think about your own week for a moment. Was there an hour, even a strange small one, when you felt something close to lightness? And did you immediately talk yourself out of it? Tell yourself it was too soon, too disrespectful, too much like forgetting? That reflex is not proof of your loyalty. It is only proof that nobody taught you the hands are allowed to stay open together. Most people spend their whole lives collapsing this tension early, picking one side and pretending the other does not exist, wearing grief like a uniform because at least a uniform is simple, or forcing cheerfulness like a performance because at least a performance has a script. And it costs them the very growth the tension was trying to produce, because Jung believed nothing new is ever born from a side that wins, only from a tension that is allowed to stay unresolved long enough to do its quiet work. I let both truths stand without asking either one to win. The third key is this: the storm looks different from higher ground. There is a moment Jung described, drawn from the old alchemical text he spent years studying, called The Secret of the Golden Flower, in which a person locked inside an unbearable inner conflict is pictured climbing to a height above it, and from that height the conflict is still visible. The storm has not stopped. The thunder has not gone quiet. But the climber is no longer standing inside the weather. They are looking down at it. And this, Jung said, is what outgrowing actually looks like. Not the disappearance of the problem, but the enlargement of the person around it. And I want you to notice something important here. This is not the same as distance. Distance would mean the loss no longer matters to you. Distance would mean you have moved away from it. But altitude is different. Altitude means the loss is exactly as close as it ever was, exactly as real, and you have simply grown a wider view around it. The mountain does not shrink the storm. The mountain only gives you somewhere to stand that the storm cannot fully occupy. And Jung was careful about this, because he had watched two false versions of climbing fail people again and again. One false version is numbing, deciding to feel nothing so the storm cannot reach you, which only buries the weather underground where it does its damage quietly. And the other false version is permanent dwelling, staying so faithfully inside the storm that you mistake the drenching for loyalty, as if refusing to climb were somehow owed to what you lost. Jung's height is neither of these. It is not above the storm because it stopped caring. It is above the storm because it grew large enough to hold the caring without drowning in it. Let me walk you through what this looks like across one ordinary day, because it is easy to nod along with a mountain metaphor and completely miss where it applies to your Tuesday. So picture the morning. You wake, and for 4 or 5 seconds before memory catches up, you are simply a person waking up. And then it catches up, and the weight lands. That is the storm at its lowest and closest. Then mid-morning arrives. You are at work. A colleague says something ordinary and unrelated, and for 2 full hours you almost forget. That is a strange kind of altitude you did not ask for, and almost feel guilty accepting. Then lunchtime, someone mentions the name, or a date, or a place, and you are back down inside the weather again, fast, no warning. Then the afternoon drags on, and you notice you got through a meeting without your voice breaking. Small, unglamorous, real altitude. Then evening comes, and you are alone again, and the storm returns at full strength, because evenings were always when you talked to them. And this is the truth almost nobody tells you. The climbing is not one clean ascent. It is this exact daily zigzag, down and up and down again, and every single time you get through an ordinary Tuesday like that one, you have grown by some fraction nobody can measure, even though it felt, most of the day, like you were failing to rise at all. Imagine, too, a man 2 years into the end of a marriage he never wanted to end, who still, every single time he drives past a certain restaurant, feels his chest tighten exactly the way it did the week she left. He has started to believe this proves he has made no progress at all. But ask him one honest question. Has the tightening gotten shorter? Has it started leaving faster than it used to? And almost always the answer is yes. The storm arrives with the same force, but it no longer owns the whole afternoon the way it once did. That shortening is the mountain, quietly, without ceremony, doing its work. Pause for a moment right now and pick one real conflict inside you that this loss has stirred up. Something with 2 honest sides. And write, even just in your head, what one side of you insists is true, then what the other side insists is true, and then simply let both sides stand there unresolved on the page. Do not force a winner. Jung's whole point about the transcendent function, which we will go deeper into shortly, is that the resolution is not something you manufacture by force. It arrives on its own once both sides have been fully and honestly heard. So this is not a task to complete. It is a posture to hold. The storm keeps happening below you, and slowly, without your noticing the exact moment it happened, you find yourself higher than you were. I climb rather than dig. The storm stays, but I do not stay inside it. The 4th key is this: the letter written to a crushed man. In 1945, someone wrote to Jung in a state that can only be described as devastated. Life had broken something in them that they could not name cleanly. And Jung wrote back, and in that letter he said something that has quietly saved people for 80 years since. He told them that the very intensity of their suffering was proof of the rightness of your life, not evidence they had done something wrong, not a punishment arriving late for some earlier mistake, but proof, direct and physical proof, that they had loved something real enough, cared about something true enough, that its loss could register this deeply. And I want you to sit with how strange that reversal actually is, because almost everyone quietly treats the size of their pain as an embarrassment, something to apologize for, something to shrink down to a more socially comfortable size before other people start to worry. Imagine a woman, a year and a half out from losing her mother, who still cries in the car sometimes on the way to work, who has started apologizing to her own reflection for still crying, telling herself she should be further along by now. And one ordinary Thursday she finally says this out loud to an old friend over coffee, braces herself for gentle concern, and instead the friend simply asks her, would you have wanted to love her less, so it would hurt less now? And she sits there completely undone by the question, because the honest answer is no, never, not for a single day of that love. And that is the exact reversal Jung was offering in 1945. The ache is not the bill for loving wrong, it is the receipt for having loved at all. Think about what this actually means for you specifically. If the ache is this large, it is because the thing you are aching for was this real. A smaller love could not produce a grief this heavy. A shallower attachment could not leave a hole this exact shape. So the very weight you have been carrying and privately apologizing for, the friends you feel you have burdened, the tears that still arrive on ordinary weekday afternoons for no announced reason, none of that is a sign of malfunction. Jung is telling that crushed man, and telling you tonight through him, that this is what it costs to have lived rightly. To have loved without holding back, to have let something matter all the way, instead of only halfway. Imagine reading a letter like that in 1945, ink on paper, someone taking the time to write back to your specific despair, and finding out that the very proof you thought damned you was actually the proof that absolved you. And once you actually let that reversal land, something small but permanent shifts in how you carry the weeks ahead. You stop measuring your grief against some imagined healthy timeline and start reading it instead as a kind of ledger of how much you were actually willing to risk loving in the first place, which is a very different arithmetic than the one grief usually hands you. I read my own pain as evidence I loved correctly, not incorrectly. If this teaching has been good company for you tonight, subscribing is a quiet way to make sure tomorrow's finds you too. The fifth key is this, the third thing that grows between them. And this is the deepest part of everything we have covered tonight. So let me walk it in 3 pieces, the way Jung himself had to walk it. First, consider what happens when you hold 2 real opposites open, honestly, without collapsing either one. The grief and the gladness from before, the missing them and the living anyway. Jung called what eventually rises out of that held tension the transcendent function. And the word transcendent here does not mean mystical or otherworldly. It means simply this. Something crosses over from the unconscious into consciousness that neither side of the argument could have produced alone. It is not a compromise. A compromise is just both sides losing a little until they meet somewhere flat and grey in the middle. This is something genuinely new. Think of it the way 2 separate elements combine into something neither one resembles on its own. Hydrogen alone cannot quench a fire, and oxygen alone feeds one. And yet held together in exactly the right proportion, they become water, which does neither of those things. It becomes its own substance, with its own nature. Nobody could have predicted water by studying hydrogen and oxygen separately and simply averaging them. And this is exactly what Jung meant. The third thing is not calculated from the 2 sides. It is born from them, and it could not have been designed in advance by the very ego that is standing there holding the tension, because the ego only ever knew the 2 ingredients it started with, not the compound they were capable of becoming. Second, consider what this looks like in an actual life, not as theory, but as a slow, unglamorous unfolding. Imagine a mother who lost a young child years ago, and who lives, for a long stretch afterward, torn between 2 positions that both feel completely honest and completely opposed. One part of her wants to love again fully, to let herself care for the living children still in her house, without holding anything back out of fear, and another part of her feels that loving fully again would be a kind of quiet abandonment of the child who is gone. As though full love has a fixed amount in it, and giving it elsewhere means giving less to the memory. For a long time she lives caught exactly between those 2 positions. Some days loving carefully, rationed, guarded, other days collapsing into guilt for having laughed too easily at dinner, and she assumes, as most people do, that eventually one side has to win, that she will either become a woman who has moved on, which frightens her, or a woman permanently suspended in mourning, which exhausts her. But what actually happens, over years, not weeks, is neither of those outcomes. Something else quietly assembles itself instead. She becomes a woman whose love for the living carries the dead child inside it, rather than in competition with it. She finds herself, without ever deciding to, telling her other children small things about their sibling in ordinary moments, at breakfast, in the car. Not as grief performed, but as memory folded naturally into the present. The loyalty did not disappear, and the living love did not shrink. They became one motion instead of two, and that motion, that specific way of loving that, only exists because both the grief and the gladness were held open long enough without either one winning, is precisely what Jung meant by the transcendent function. It is not something she built, it is something that grew, the way a compound forms once the right elements are held near enough to each other for long enough. Third, and this is the part I want to turn directly toward you now, because I want you to notice something honest about your own particular loss. Whatever shape it takes, you have probably been assuming, quietly, that the person you become on the other side of this will be a smaller version of who you were before it happened, diminished, reduced, by exactly the size of what is missing. And I understand completely why you would think that, because right now, in the middle of it, all you can feel is the missing piece. But think for a moment about how a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. It is not a matter of the caterpillar simply growing wings while staying essentially itself. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar's body actually breaks down almost entirely first, dissolves into something formless, and it is only out of that formless dissolving that the wholly different shape assembles itself. If you opened the chrysalis at the wrong moment, you would find neither a caterpillar nor a butterfly. You would find only the uncomfortable in-between. And if you had never seen this happen before, you would swear something had gone terribly wrong. And this, I think, is the most honest picture of where you are tonight. The discomfort you have been calling stuck, the sensation of being neither who you were nor who you are going to be, is not evidence of failure. It is exactly what the middle of a real transformation feels like from the inside. The person being assembled out of your grief and your gladness, held together, is not a smaller you. They are someone who could not have existed at all without exactly this loss having happened. Not despite it, because of it. And that person is not finished yet, which is precisely why you cannot feel them yet. You can only feel the two flames leaning toward each other, and the faint, unfamiliar warmth of something small rising in the space between them that has no name yet. Because it has never existed in you before, I let the loss make a third self it could never have made alone. The sixth key is this, the rightness you could not see yet, because here is where we land. Tonight will only make sense if you have already lost something, and if you are still here, still listening this far in. You have, and I want to say plainly that everything we have walked through, the tension you are not supposed to resolve, the storm you learn to view from higher ground rather than escape, the letter that told a crushed man his pain was proof of a rightly lived life. The third self quietly assembling itself out of two opposites you thought could never agree. None of it was ever asking you to feel better faster. It was only ever asking you to trust a process you cannot see the middle of while you are standing inside it. And here is why this is so hard to believe about your own life specifically. Growth of this kind never shows itself while it is happening. Imagine a parent who pencils a small mark on the doorframe every year to track a child's height. And for 364 of those days, nothing seems to move at all. The child looks the same at breakfast every single morning. No visible inch. No announced change. And then one ordinary afternoon, a grandparent visits after a year away and stops cold in the doorway, stunned, asking when did this happen? And the honest answer is, nobody saw it happen. It happened in the sleeping hours. In the unremarkable Tuesdays, in exactly the stretch of time that felt, from the inside, like nothing was occurring. And think for a moment about something as ordinary as a bruise, the kind you get from bumping a table edge in the dark. In the first hour it is only a dull ache and nothing to see. By the next morning it has gone a deep and almost alarming purple, and it looks, if anything, worse than the injury felt at the time, and this frightens people who do not understand bruises. They think the purple means the damage is spreading, when in fact, the purple is the body's own slow proof that repair has already begun beneath the surface. The color you are afraid of is evidence of the mending, not evidence against it. Your grief has its own version of that purple, the flat months, the harder days that arrive well after the loss itself, the ones that make you think you are somehow getting worse instead of better. And Jung would ask you to consider that this darkening you fear might be repair working exactly the way repair is supposed to work, simply doing it in a color you were never taught to read correctly. Your grief is being measured the same way. Not by you, not in real time. You do not get to stand at the doorframe of your own healing and watch the pencil mark climb. You only get the visit from the version of yourself a year from now who stops in the doorway of some ordinary evening and realizes, almost by accident, that a weight has shifted, that a room in the house of you has been quietly furnished after all. And that is Jung's whole quiet promise here. Not that the ache disappears on schedule, but that the very thing you are calling stuck is the sensation of a root doing its slow, invisible work below the surface, where no one, including you, can watch it happen. I trust the growing I cannot yet measure. Here is the whole picture. The grief was never a puzzle to be solved. It was a root system doing exactly what roots do. Two honest opposites can be held open without either one being forced to win. The storm below you does not need to stop for you to rise above it. The intensity of your pain was never a verdict against you. It was proof of the rightness of what you loved, held long enough without collapsing. Two opposites give birth to a third thing neither of them could have made alone. And that third thing is not a smaller you. It is a you that could only have come from exactly this loss. All six of these were never six separate keys at all. They were six turns of the same single key, which is simply this: nothing in you needs fixing. Something in you is still growing. And growing, unlike fixing, cannot be rushed, only trusted. So if tonight found you in the middle of that growing, unfinished, unmeasured, a little raw at the edges, you are not behind. You are exactly where a root is supposed to be at this depth. And the unconscious, once made conscious, does not ache in quite the same way twice. It becomes instead something closer to memory that finally knows how to sit still. So let me leave you with the same thing the title already told you. This only makes sense if you have already lost something. And maybe the real question, the one worth carrying with you tonight, is not when the ache will finally end, but what exactly it has been quietly building in you this whole time, without your permission, without your notice, all the way down at the root.